Good morning, everybody. I just heard the church bells outside of my window here ring the hour of 9 a.m. So welcome everybody to San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing annual conference. We're really proud here at the San Diego Housing Federation to be co-hosting with the SDRAFFH. My name is Stephen Russell. I'm the president and CEO of the San Diego Housing Federation. And it is a thrill. It's one that I'm really excited about every year that we get to share this day together and take a look at various dimensions of affordable housing and fair housing that go, because we know that fair housing is not just the absence of discrimination, but it is the affirmative actions that we can all take to counter the discriminatory history of our nation and of the housing market within that nation. So it's a very exciting endeavor here for us. I do want to just remind folks some of the reminders that you've seen popping up on the screen, that we do have two different links. The morning sessions each day have one link. The afternoon sessions have another link, and that allows us to prepare and have a green room for our presenters before we come into the program each day. So please save both links and be sure to check in when you have the opportunity, just when time is appropriate. Before we begin here, I did want to thank the sponsors of the conference this year. In addition to the San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing, or SDRAFFH as we call them, the San Diego Housing Federation is the co-sponsor. We also want to thank California Department of Housing and Community Development, Union Bank, Studio E Architects, and the San Diego Housing Commission for their sponsorship of this day. I really want to give a big shout out to the staff of the San Diego Housing Federation that's been key in presenting this. Marissa Imani, who organizes our HEAL network and our RUN Residents United network. Laura Nunn, our Director of Policy and Education here at the Federation. Sneha Craig, who just is our office manager, but that title does not begin to describe all the tasks she does. And most of all, I want to thank our invisible assistant here right now, Brooklyn Del Priori, who has made sure that all of this took place and is just an absolute pillar for the organization in presenting this program today. I also want to thank, we have a couple of special guests here today. Jose Rodriguez, the Vice Mayor of the City of National City. Are you here? I believe I think I saw you come in. We have also representing the office of San Diego City Councilmember Joe LaCava. We have Kathleen Ferrier present as well. Thank you for being here. So the last thing I want to say before, we're going to get the program started here momentarily, but I did want to say that the work of the Federation in fair housing is very important. It's at our core, the availability of housing, of quality housing for everybody is really what we are about. One of the things we are doing right now, and I would hope that you would check out on our website, is our responses to the various cities' housing elements. We're right now in the new housing element cycle. All of the municipalities in the county of San Diego are preparing their own housing elements. Within those housing elements, there is required to be a component of fair housing that the HCD will review. We've provided comment letters on all of these. We'd encourage you to take a look at those letters. They're on our website, and I think Lauren Nunn is dropping that website in the chat. Look at those letters, and because it suggests various policy approaches to both the production of more affordable housing, but also how we are going to address fair housing in future plans for each of these cities. So with that, I will encourage you to follow along in our digital program. The full bios of all of our guests are there. They'll get introductions, but they're amazing people and deserve that you take the time to look at their bios in the program. And with that, I'm going to introduce our co-host, the chair of the president, chair of San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing and executive director of CSA, County of San Diego, Estela de los Rios. Estela, are you here?
Thank you, Steve, for your introduction. Good morning. On behalf of San Diego Regional Alliance for Fair Housing, I welcome you all to our 5th annual Fair Housing Conference. This past year has been a very challenging time for our San Diego region and for our entire nation. As the world turned upside down due to the pandemic, housing became the hot topic as tenants and landlords struggled to make rent and mortgage payments. Rent moratoriums were initiated and extended continuously for an entire year to this day. The COVID-19 crisis has shed a light on longstanding disparities in housing that has worsened negative health and economic outcomes in communities of color. Most importantly, its disparate outcomes reflect a host of fair housing problems as well. The adverse COVID-19 health outcomes for people of color are a manifestation of segregation and an absence of opportunity in our neighborhoods of color. The pandemic has magnified housing instability for renters and for landlords. Neighborhoods with more renters of color face higher rates of eviction. People of color are disproportionately experience homelessness. For the next 2 days, we will explore, discuss, and analyze how the faces of fair housing impacted our lives. We will be joined by fair housing practitioners, policymakers, housing advocates, developers, community leaders, and top experts to discuss housing discrimination issues and solutions to improve our communities. As we celebrate Fair Housing Month, we remember the Housing Act of 1968. We honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King and move forward to eradicating housing discrimination. Our fight to fully enforce the law's provision continues. Thank you for being part of our efforts to affirmatively further fair housing. Lastly, I'd like to thank the dedicated staff from the Housing Federation and its CEO, Stephen Russell, for dedicating their time to make this possible, and our SDRAFFH, San Diego Regional for Fair Housing Committee, for their dedication and commitment to host every year and make this possible. So with that, I begin. Again, good morning and thank you for joining us. Our first session is titled Trends in Fair Housing. Our speaker will be Dr. Daniel Enmark, a senior economist from the San Diego Workforce Partnership and an advocate to improve policies for equity in our labor market. And our moderator will be a native of City Heights, Mr. Ricardo Flores, Executive Director of Local Initiatives Support Corporation. Thank you. With that, Ricardo, begin.
Thank you so much, Estela. I really appreciate the introduction, and I'm happy to be here. And Steve, and to your team, thank you for putting this together. It's more important than ever that we talk about fair housing and we talk about the issues that face us as a community. I think rightfully so, people are asking, what is happening in our community? Why are homelessness increasing? Why do we have high poverty rates? And we know the answers. For the folks on this presentation and the folks joining us, the answer is housing. It's all housing related. And so I'm very happy to have Dr. Daniel Enmark here. Dr. Enmark has a very unique and interesting background that I'm excited for him to share with you. He's currently with the Workforce Partnership, where he helps with strategy and policy to help with respect to inequality and to structural racism, and how the Workforce Partnership can do better by the community in focusing on those issues. But prior to that, he has a degree from economics and political economics, as he'll hopefully share with you all, and a unique and interesting background and a presentation that is very exciting. And so we're happy to have you, Daniel. Please go ahead.
That is a very generous introduction that I can only disappoint from here. So let me just launch right into it. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm gonna, let me start out here by sharing my slides. Just one moment. Brooklyn, I'm not seeing an option here. Oh, here we go. Great. Okay, sorry for the delay. Okay, so sorry, just waiting for this to, here we go. So San Diego County, 5th largest county in America. We have 1% of the US population. It's 3.3 million people. So the challenges are going to be proportionately bigger. If we look at where people live, it's mostly along the coast. And if you look at patterns, this is a map where every dot is a person. And if you look at the patterns here, you notice that it's not just an integrated rainbow of colors, but we see patterns of where people live. And we'll talk about why that's the case. We are a majority minority county in that it's, we don't have any single racial or ethnic majority. A quarter of the county is foreign born, and if we include children in households of people who are foreign born, the size of our immigrant community is actually significantly larger than that. Let's see. And then you all, since you're dealing with housing, are familiar with this particular feature of San Diego County, which is that our median home price is wildly high and getting higher by the moment. As of Q3 2020, San Diego County's median home price was something like $650,000. Now it's actually over $700,000, which puts us in the top half of 1%, or maybe the top 3/4 of 1% of counties in the US. If we look at monthly rent for renters, we also see that San Diego is kind of above the curve. And what that means here is, what I've done is I've charted major cities in the United States by the median monthly income of residents and the median 2-bedroom rent. So you'd see that that you would expect here,
hey, Daniel,
based on,
could you remove the pencil box right there in the corner? I don't know if you see it, but we see a pencil box that's covering, it's on the right-hand side. It's right here.
A pencil box.
Yeah, it's like a pencil with colors. There you go. Oh, wait, there, now it's gone. Sorry.
Oh, a pencil. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, I will get rid of it.
That's perfect. Thank you. No, thank you. Please, sorry.
Thank you for the heads up. That is just so I can make a nice, colorful presentation. Okay. So if we were to take the predicted rent based on every other city in the United States and say, okay, for a city that makes on average, where residents make on average $7,000 a month, which is quite high, well done, San Diego, you would expect the rent to be $1,850 for a 2-bedroom apartment. But in fact, it's $2,400, which means that every month, residents here are paying $550 more than you would expect given their income. So from here, we're going to get into kind of how these dynamics play out along racial and ethnic lines. And some of this information, frankly, is disturbing. And so I want to give a little word of caution first, and I want to encourage people to care for themselves however they need to. And if if I'm sharing some information that is, it is objectively disturbing, but if you find that it's kind of overwhelming, then I just encourage you to step away from your computer or put me on mute or whatever it is that you need. I'm going to be kind of relentlessly giving you a barrage of pretty challenging information, and some of it kind of can be emotionally triggering. And I just want to encourage people not to feel like they have to continue to drink from the fire hose if that's feeling overwhelming. So 3 things that I really want to communicate today are that racial inequality is severe in San Diego County, that it isn't caused by any innate differences in genetics or culture. It was actually created on purpose by public policy. And that's hard to accept, but it was created on purpose, intentionally, by public policy, and it's perpetuated by our implicit biases. And then the third thing is that we all own this problem together. It affects all of us, and we all need to work together to fix it. So, first of all, just to give a sense of the scale of the problem, the average white family in America has 10 times the wealth of the average Black or Hispanic family. 10 times the wealth. They say income is how you make it by, and wealth is how you get ahead. But also wealth is how you avoid falling behind. And we'll get back to that in a bit. But just to calibrate your expectations here in terms of the scale of the problem, white families have 10 times the wealth families of color. This is not the natural state of things. This is not just what happens when you take off the controls and step back and say, what will happen if we give everybody equal opportunity? If we gave everybody equal opportunity, truly equal opportunity, we would see no differences. There's no scientific evidence for difference in ability or work ethic or intelligence. So this is not the natural state of things. This is hugely unnatural. Okay, so let's look at a map of adult earnings by the area in which you grew up. Now, you're probably used to looking at maps where maybe the areas of the map are colored in based on how much money people are making in that area. That's not what this map is. This map is showing you how much are adults making in their 30s based on how much are adults making in their 30s who grew up in this area. So for example, you see there's for example, in the middle, you see Poway, right? And it's kind of like light greenish blue. That doesn't mean that people in Poway are making $47,000 a year. It means that people who grew up there are now, wherever they live, making that amount of money. So you can see that there are big differences in the earnings of adults who grew up in different areas of San Diego County, with a big concentration of red in Southeast San Diego and in the southern area of the county, a big concentration of blue in some of the wealthier areas, whether that's University City, whether that's, kind of central coastal area, but you see big differences. Now let's look just at white adults who grew up in San Diego. So you'll notice a big change. We've gone back, here's everybody, here's white, here's everybody, here's white. So you see a big shift toward the blue area, which is up toward the $80,000 a year range. And here's the kicker. In this slide, I'm only showing you the earnings of people who grew up in middle income families. So the difference between the earnings of the white individuals and everybody is not that, well, these folks grew up richer. I'm controlling for that. I'm just showing you the earnings of people who grew up in middle income families. What I'm showing you is the effect of all of the benefits that pile upon a person in terms of how they're treated in the educational system, in the financial system, in the justice system, and in the labor system by being white, right? Now let's look at people who grew up Black in San Diego. Huge difference. First of all, I want you to notice the enormous shift toward the red end of the spectrum, which is lower incomes. And again, remember, these are people who grew up in middle income families. The second thing I want you to notice is that most of this map is gray, which means there weren't enough individuals growing up in those areas who are Black for us to be able to estimate an average income because of segregation. Nobody was growing up in these areas Black. Okay, so another way that we can look at the effects of racial inequality is by youth disconnection. Youth disconnection is the percentage of people who are both out of school and unemployed between the ages of 16 and 24. And what you see here is fairly predictable. You know, if you know the difference between Lemon Grove and Carlsbad, the differences between, you know, Otay Mesa and University Heights, it's not too surprising to find that the disconnection rate is somewhere around 5% in these richer neighborhoods, and somewhere around 15 and above, 18% in these poor neighborhoods. But it's even worse than that, because if we chart the neighborhoods by the portion of people in that neighborhood who are Hispanic, Black, or Indigenous, we see that there's a very strong correlation. I mean, this is, as a social scientist, this is an unusually strong correlation between the proportion of the community that's BIPOC, right, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and the disconnection rate. So, you know, another way we can look at this is, what does the overall workforce look like? Well, the overall workforce is just a little bit over half white and Asian, and a little bit under half Hispanic, Black, multiracial, Indigenous, Pacific Islander. So then if we look at a high-paying sector like life sciences and biotech, we find it's 4/5 white and Asian. And all of the other categories have only half of the representation that they have in the overall workforce. Another way to look at this is occupational segregation, which is a fancy way of saying, are people who are white or Asian disproportionately getting filtered into occupations where they have more earning potential? So controlling for that fact that we know that white men get paid more for the same work as women and people of color, set that aside. Do they even have the opportunity to do the same work? And the answer is no, it's not equal. You see this very dramatic upward curve here, where the higher the percentage of the occupation that's white and Asian, the higher the median income is. Now, you might be curious about why I'm putting white and Asian workers together in one segment, and I'd love to talk about that in the question and answer if people are curious about that. We know that Asian Americans face discrimination, and there's been a lot in the news lately about some of the violent discrimination that they faced in America. But we also know that the discrimination that they face is different than the discrimination faced by Black and Hispanic and Indigenous Americans. And there's a lot of data about how teachers and hiring managers and justice, people in the justice system view Black and Hispanic Americans especially, and how that differs from the way that they view other people. So we can talk about that more. So racial inequality, we've seen some snapshots of how bad is it? How does it look in San Diego County specifically? Now let's talk about how we got here. Well, it was created on purpose. When you ask the average white American, why might it be that Black folks have a harder time getting ahead? They cite cultural things, family instability, lack of good role models, lack of motivation to work hard. I mean, this is all, I'm sorry, BS. There's zero evidence. I mean, if you look at the number of hours worked by white folks and Black folks, it's actually higher for Black folks, right? So like lack of motivation to work hard is just meaningless. That doesn't make any sense. So why is it? Well, obviously the first thing that we have to talk about is that for a majority of the history of America, out of 400 years, 250 of those had a system of chattel slavery, where Black people weren't viewed as people at all. They were viewed as property. 250 years of that, 150 years since. But it goes beyond that. And this is something that's very disturbing, but around the turn of the century, in 1903, pretend lynching was such a popular children's game that this newspaper article worries that it might overtake baseball among white children. that white children were too busy pretending to lynch Black people as a game. It's very disturbing to contemplate this. But at some point in the early 20th century, the United States Postal Service had to ban lynching postcards because they were, beyond obscene. In the late teens and early 20s, there was a wave of mob violence perpetrated by white Americans against Black communities. The most famous of them being the Tulsa Massacre, which wiped out Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which literally involved white community members hiring private planes to drop bombs on the Black community. And all of this without any repercussions from law enforcement because it was condoned by the justice system. Folks might have heard a lot lately, and certainly in your line of work, about redlining. This is San Diego County. This is San Diego's redlining map. It was put together by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was a federal agency, and the Office of the City Engineer of San Diego. So this was the government setting this up. And I've read the documents that they used to determine what areas are red, what areas are green, and everything in between. And they explicitly reference not just the racial composition of each neighborhood, but the efforts made by the neighborhoods to prevent people who were not white from moving in. And for example, Talmadge is praised by the people who created this map for their efforts to prevent people of color from moving into the neighborhood. And as a result, banks were advised to give more money to people moving to or building houses in those neighborhoods. So, we looked before at that map of, what kind of money do people make when they grow up? And you might see something familiar here, which is, here's Kensington and Talmadge and City Heights in the redlining map. And here it is nearly 100 years later in terms of looking at economic opportunity. So another example of the ongoing intentional efforts to prevent the development of wealth among people of color in San Diego County is the building of Highway 94. You might not know, Highway 94 was built specifically to prevent Black folks who lived in Southeast San Diego from moving to the white communities of South Park and Golden Hill. That highway was built to reinforce segregation in the 50s. In 1964, over 2/3 of white San Diegans voted to support housing segregation. For many of us, that's our parents' generation. This is a excerpt from a peer-reviewed scientific article in the Geographic Review in 1979. Black San Diegans experienced extreme segregation and strong discrimination in the city. They mention actually that that San Diego is referred to as Little Georgia in the Black community. Until 1968, Black San Diegans could not easily rent or buy outside Southeast. In fact, Black San Diegans were harassed for hanging out in areas away from Southeast, harassed by the police. A study of 29 San Diego neighborhoods showed that all of them contained racial covenants. And in fact, in the 70s, when we started building UCSD, Roger Revelle had to go around to the real estate agents in La Jolla and say, you have racial covenants and kind of unspoken agreements not to sell houses to Jewish people. And we can't build a university if we can only hire white Protestant professors, this was in the 70s, and not just for Black people, but for the wrong kind of white people. This is a recent phenomenon. In 1977, the Union Tribune found that less than 2% of home loans were made in minority communities. And this is just a small sampling. And, you know, it goes everything from the very beginning. The first governor of California in his inaugural address said, we are waging a war of extinction against the Native Americans. He did not use the term Native Americans. He used a slur. The California Anti-Vagrancy Act, which basically legalized the harassment by not just formal police forces, but by informal mobs of people who were indigenous or Mexican. We talked about the Red Summer of 1919, the fact that Asians were denied citizenship and property until the mid 20th century, Japanese internment, Operation Wetback, which is hard to just talk about because the name itself is racist, but you know, this is the second episode in which people along the southern border were using the government used military style tactics to deport scores and scores and scores of Mexican Americans, including citizens, people who were born in America. In the mid 20th century, the Highway Act was built to destroy Black communities. And we have records of public officials getting together and picking out the Black communities that they were going to destroy, that they would build a highway through in order to destroy the community. Okay, so that's on purpose. And you might say, well, that's just disturbing. It's terrible, but it's in the past, right? Well, aren't things getting better, right? Well, they are getting better. And a lot of those laws and policies and practices have been taken away. The problem is that those practices were so successful that they guaranteed a relationship, a coupling of observable race and poverty. And poverty comes with all kinds of concomitant phenomena. So, you know, crime, unemployment, all of the things that you associate with poverty, now people associate with race. And that's implicit bias. For example, in the school system, school culture is permeated by a belief that African-American families do not value education, and that creates teacher expectations for students of color and disproportionate punishment. When in fact, controlling for socioeconomic status, African-American and Hispanic families are more involved than white families. We know that white teachers have lower expectation of their Black students than Black teachers do. We know that those lower expectations actually create lower performance. In fact, there's this fascinating literature that shows that when you lie to teachers, if you say, we gave your students a test and these 5 students showed the highest promise, the greatest academic potential, and instead of picking students who did well on the test, you randomly assign 5 of those students to be the ones that you tell the teacher are the best. A year later, those students at the top of their class because of the greater attention that they get from the teachers. But unfortunately, because our teachers have low expectations of Black and Hispanic students, they're not teaching them equally to the way that they're teaching white students. We know that Black students are less likely to be referred to gifted programs, even with the same test scores. And we know that Black and Hispanic families receive harsher discipline, even controlling for family socioeconomic status, for the same infractions as their white peers. In San Diego County, the schools are offering college prep classes to 60% of white students, but only 40% of Black students. They're preparing the majority of their white students to perform at grade level in English and math, and the minority of Black students to succeed at that level. The San Diego sheriffs stopped Black folks at twice the rate of white folks, and the San Diego City Police at 3 times the rate. And both are 50% more likely to use force. And they're more likely to search drivers, Black drivers, nearly twice as likely, even though they're more than half again more likely to find contraband among white drivers. So even as a racial profiling strategy, it's exactly the opposite wrong strategy. You can't explain this without implicit racial bias. Black San Diegans are 5 times more likely to get prosecuted for minor drug offenses than whites and Hispanics. I was recently on a jury, in the jury selection process. And when they asked me, do I have any concerns about the case? I said, well, I do. We're trying a Black San Diegan for a minor drug offense. And why are we trying this person? You know, if this person is 5 times more likely to be prosecuted than a white peer, there's no way, even if we render a fair judgment, that the outcome is fair. Unsurprisingly, they took me off the jury. It wasn't my intention. Field experiments showed discrimination against Black applicants for jobs has not changed in the last 25 years, while discrimination against Hispanic candidates have declined slightly. There are these audit studies where you send out resumes and you say, okay, here's 2 identical resumes. The only difference is that one of them at the top has the name Lakeisha Jones, and one of them has Emily Grove or something like that. And you send out these resumes, and you randomly assign who gets the Black applicant and the white applicant. And they find that Emily gets 50% more callbacks than Lakeisha, having the identical resume, just because people assume she's Black, or people assume that Emily is white. And with even more intensive audit studies where they send out actors, you know, people who are trained, confederates of the experimenter, who go out and apply for jobs. And again, they have identical resumes, except some of them are randomly assigned to have a felony record. And the white applicants with felony records get more callbacks than the Black applicants with a clean record. Imagine that. If you are applying for a job in America today, you'd be better off being a white person with a felony record than a Black person with a clean record. If you look at the business lending, the increase to credit lines if minority-owned businesses were treated like white-owned businesses is ranging between nearly 150% to nearly 250%. And part of this, we have to acknowledge, is connected to overall income inequality. And I'll tell you why. In the 1950s, we had a very progressive taxation system, meaning people at the very top of the income distribution, their income beyond a certain level was being taxed at 70%, something that you couldn't imagine today. Now let's look at what's happened over the last 70 years. We now have essentially a flat tax that's actually regressive at the highest end. So it's actually true what Warren Buffett says, that his secretary pays a higher tax rate than he does. Why does this exacerbate racial inequality? Because it's resulted in a dramatic growth in incomes at the very top end of the income distribution that has not been matched at the bottom end. And the problem is, because of all of these very successful racial discrimination attempts over the last 400 years, people of color are disproportionately on the lower end of the income spectrum. So even though median Black income has risen in the United States over the last 50 years, and what that means is, if you were to line up 100 representative Americans by order of wealth, where the first person made the least and the 100th person made the most, and you were to say, where's the average white person in America? The median white person is in place maybe 55, 60, something like that. The median black person, of all the black people, if you line them up and you say, okay, well, where do you stand in these 100 people? In 1970, they would have been in place 25, meaning 75% of Americans were making more money than they are. Over the next 50 years, they climbed steadily from 25th place to 35th place, which is dramatic. As an economist, you never see changes like this. This is really incredible. And it's the result of hard work. We talked earlier about that idea of work ethic. You do not climb your way up the American ladder without putting in really hard work. These are people who raise their wealth in terms of their rank in the US compared to their parents. And it's incredible. They closed nearly half of the gap between where they were and perfect equality. But during that time, Black income as a percent of white income has been unchanged at about 55%. How is that possible? Climbing up the ladder hasn't resulted in income growing with respect to white peers. The reason is because everybody on the top end of the income spectrum has been getting so much richer that even though you're climbing up from very low in the bottom half to much higher in the bottom half, your income as a proportion of their income isn't growing. It's as if you climbed up a ladder and then the bottom half of the ladder shrunk right beneath your feet. So you're no higher off the ground, even though you've climbed up many rungs. So this overall income inequality in America is really contributing to the persistence of racial income inequality. It's exacerbated by the pandemic. If we look at December 2019 compared to December 2020, the biggest increase in unemployment has been among Hispanic Americans. We now have a kind of a two-tiered system where white and Asian Americans have an unemployment rate of around 6%, while Black and Hispanic Americans have an unemployment rate that's 50% higher. So the question is, are we going to go back to where we were in a recovery? Or are we going to try to get to some kind of equality? Finally, we all own this problem and it affects all of us. The study from the Quarterly Journal of Economics says drawing more low-income and minority children into science and innovation could reduce the persistence of inequality across generations while stimulating growth. If women, minorities, and children from low-income families were to invent at the same rate as white men, there would be 4 times as many inventors in the United States. This is an issue of lost human capital. Only 37% of San Diego high school graduates complete college. Hispanics are near majority in San Diego schools, but they're least prepared for high-paying jobs. This is all from a report from the regional EDC, the Economic Development Corporation. They found that 53% of San Diego families can't afford the cost of living. Left unaddressed, they said, San Diego will no longer be an attractive place to live or work. What do we do about this? Well, there are some systems in economics that are self-equilibrating, meaning they reach an equilibrium. So for example, in price, when we look at price, you might have seen this kind of supply and demand chart before. Say there's a widget that's worth $100, where at $100, there are 500 units of supply. People are willing to supply 500, build 500 of these widgets. And then there are 500 people who want to buy those widgets at $100. And in a system like that, if it gets out of whack, if the suppliers start charging $200, demand's going to go down to 0. And the system will get back to equilibrium. Basically, they'll charge $200. Nobody will buy the thing. Someone will say, well, we got to get rid of this stock. They'll start discounting it. And they'll basically discount it until it gets to about $100 and people are buying units again. Or if they charge too little, There's going to be a glut on the market. They're going to realize, wow, we could charge more for this thing, right? And then it will reach equilibrium. That's a system in economics that reaches equilibrium. Then there are also systems that don't reach equilibrium. Think of, for example, the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It starts to lean, and if you don't put weight on this side, it's just going to lean more and more until it falls down. You know, we've got all these engineers in Pisa, if you've ever been to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, who are adding weight and more weight and more weight and systems to hold up that leaning tower, because it's not going to equilibrate. It's not going to come back to center. It's going to keep getting farther and farther off. Well, income and wealth are like that. They're not an equilibrating system. They are a path-dependent system. In general, the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer without intervention. So if you have a system where by our ancestors' intervention, we've created a system where people of color have less resources than wealthy people, that system is just going to get worse and worse and worse without intervening. So when people say, well, gosh, slavery ended 150 years ago, and Jim Crow, that ended 50 years ago. And, you know, 6 whole years ago, we stopped, you know, disproportionately penalizing Black people for using crack cocaine compared to powder cocaine for white people in California, right? Like some of these laws are pretty recent, right? But they say, well, that's all over. Well, so why don't we see equality? Because this isn't a system that you could just leave alone and everything will get back to equality. This is a system where the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer. So unless we put our hand on the scale, unless we intervene in the same ways that our ancestors so creatively intervened in order to create inequality, we need to bring the same creativity to creating equality that our ancestors brought to destroying it. And it's going to take real effort. So I want to share some thoughts on the San Diego Regional Analysis of Impediments to Fair Housing. Fantastic document. I encourage all of you to read this. It really outlines a lot of the challenges that people face when they go to apply, for housing, when they seek out housing. It talks about barriers faced by LGBTQIA folks, people who with disabilities, all kinds of groups of people who are facing impediments to housing. But as an economist, when I look at something like this, I say, but what are the underlying economic factors that we might think aren't discriminatory, but are the result of discrimination? So if you strip communities of their wealth, like we have with the Black and Hispanic community and Indigenous community, especially in San Diego, you don't have to discriminate them to keep against them to keep them out of your neighborhood. You took all their wealth, they can't afford to live in your neighborhood. So you might not think that that's a racial impediment to fair housing, but it absolutely is, because the wealth was taken from those people because of their race. And now they can't afford housing because they have no wealth. Decades of withholding financing because of redlining prevented home building in Black neighborhoods. So even folks who succeed can't buy a home in their own neighborhood. My wife and I recently purchased a house. We were really interested in living in City Heights. Guess what? There aren't a lot of houses. There aren't a lot of single family homes in City Heights because nobody could get financing from a bank for the last 100 years to build a house there because of redlining. So wealthy people who lived outside of City Heights, mostly white, built apartment buildings there. And they rented to the local residents. So now, even if you do well, it's going to be a lot harder to buy a home in your neighborhood because there aren't homes in your neighborhood. That's a form of racial housing discrimination. As I said, white folks were very creative in crafting methods to strip people of color of their wealth. Can we be that creative today in our efforts to create opportunity? Here's another quote from the impediments analysis. In 2012 and 2017, Blacks and Hispanics were nearly twice as likely as Asians to receive a subprime loan. White applicants were not using subprime loans. Well, why does somebody need a subprime loan? Bad credit is caused by delinquent debt. You're not paying your debts. Why don't you pay your debts? Delinquency arises when your wealth is insufficient to cover your debt. As I said before, wealth is not just how you get ahead, it's how you avoid getting behind, falling behind. When your wealth has been taken from you and you fall on hard times or you lose a job, you can't pay your bills. And if you can't pay your bills, your credit gets tanked. And if your credit gets tanked, you can't secure housing, right? So again, you might think this isn't discrimination. It's not racial discrimination. We're just looking objectively at the financial risk of letting this person rent from us or buy our house. Well, the problem is that because our society has created a link between race and wealth, that is a racial problem. And if we're going to get to equality, we can't just say, well, let's just look at the financial factors and it'll all sort itself out, because it's not an equilibrating system. It gets worse and worse if you leave it alone. So we need to think creatively, not just about making sure that there aren't any new impediments to housing, but to actively remove impediments for people who come from communities that have been historically stolen from. Okay, finally, let's wrap up on a positive note, which is, you can make a change, and I'm coming from Workforce Partnerships, so I just want to plug us. We would be very happy to help. And I encourage people to reach out to me after this presentation. Think of it as you have successfully completed this, session if you think of a creative way to address inequality. If you can't think of a creative way to address inequality or aren't interested in discovering one, you haven't successfully completed this morning's activity. So one way you could do that is send me an email. My email address is daniel@workforce.org, daniel@workforce.org, and either say, I've got this idea, or help me come up with an idea. I'm interested. Okay, so employers, employee ownership models are hugely important for wealth building. And there are a lot of white employers in San Diego who employ people of color. And if you have the ability to create an employee ownership model, you can allow those workers to develop wealth as a product of their work. A bonus is that employee-owned companies, that the tax system is bonkers. If you have a fully employee-owned company that's an S Corp, you are paying zero income taxes for your business. And the money that you raise when you sell the company to your employees can grow tax deferred and be handed off, and can be handed off to heirs tax-free. It's just wild, the benefits of creating an employee ownership model. And we've been working with local employers to do this. So if you know anybody who might be interested in creating employee ownership here in San Diego, that is a major step toward racial equality. Another thing is referrals. When you refer somebody for a job, it turns out that 70% of referrals are for white candidates. Well, there are a lot of companies that are thinking creatively about this. Pinterest had a 6-week diverse referral challenge, and they found that it dramatically increased the referrals of women and people of color. Intel pays $4,000 for any referral of an underrepresented individual that leads to hiring. They've increased the portion of underrepresented workers by 14% since implementing this policy. There are things like the Rooney Rule, which is in the NFL is like, you can't hire somebody until you at least have one interview with a candidate of color. There's some evidence that it's actually beneficial to have 2 people who are underrepresented in the pool, that it's actually dramatically increases the chances of hiring somebody who's underrepresented. Paid internships for students can lead to full-time employment, and that can create economic opportunity and create a bridge from our flawed educational system to the world of work for young people of color. We've done a lot of work around that, and feel free to reach out about that. Educators can confront the fact that there is bias in the system. There's a fascinating study that showed that teachers, when they spoke with parents, they found that in a parent-teacher conference, they were on average surprised to learn that Black parents were more involved in their students' education than the teachers thought they were. But those same teachers asked 9 months later, when they had forgotten about the parent-teacher conference, how involved those same parents were in their children's education, dramatically lowered their estimate of how involved the parents were, because their memory of reality, which they had learned through the parent-teacher conference, had been replaced by a heuristic driven by their racial biases. This is widespread. So teachers need to recognize that. They need to work with career exploration. There's evidence that internalized racism is associated with lower career aspirations, so we need to address that. Cajon Valley School District created a career center in their school library, which is really incredible. If you know people who are interested in that, I encourage you to reach out. We have this program called My Next Move that helps people explore careers and gives people examples of professionals in different fields. This is that career center in the library. It's gorgeous. In politics, there's a lot that we need to do. Local policies and institutions created this inequality, and we need to address it. We need better training for our police. The US has less training, less weeks of training for police than by far than the average advanced industrial society. We need to change that. We need to shift more of the work that needs to be done by social workers to social workers, right? You need to ask how much of the work that police do really needs to be done by somebody with a gun. So we need to think about that, right? It's not enough to invest equally. I talked with Mayor Falconer back when he was Mayor of San Diego, and I said, what's the goal in terms of creating equity across communities? And he said, well, we've been really intentional about investing equally in every community. And my response was, that's wrong. Well, that's a great way to perpetuate inequality, because this city has been underinvesting in some communities for decades. And now our solution is to just keep things the way that they are. Well, we need to invest more in communities of color. The San Diego Unified School District, their model of equity is same dollars for every student. Well, that doesn't work when you've got kids of professors in La Jolla and you've got, refugee students who have zero formal education. I used to do math tutoring at Crawford High. And, we had students who would come in who had never heard of decimals or fractions in their junior year, because they haven't had that educational background. The idea that the same dollars would equally support that person and somebody whose kids are UCSD professors is absurd. Another thing that we're working on right now is fair scheduling. So, or what's called stable scheduling, which is, the hourly workers are disproportionately women and people of color, and many of them in retail, food services, accommodations, and throughout all the sectors, they're given their schedules at the very last minute. Well, how do you arrange for childcare when you get your schedule at the last minute? How do you hold down a second job when you get your schedule at the very last minute? How do you plan your life when you can't plan your work? So we've been talking with city council members about stable scheduling, requiring employers to give 2 weeks advance notice for their schedules, and having a conversation with employers. We've brought in employers to talk about, how is this going to hurt them and how can we adjust anything so that it really does serve the needs not only of the workers, but of the employers. so that's an example of some of the things that we all can be doing. And I think housing, because it's such a central component of the decades of policy that created this challenge, it's got to be a central vehicle for changing things. It's got to be a central part of how we undo the damage that's been done. So that's, I guess, the presentation, and I just welcome any questions and thoughts and conversation. Oh, Ricardo, I think you are on mute.
Oh, sorry, there we go. Daniel, that was incredible. I mean, it really was. And I think that when you started off and you said this is going to be disturbing, I thought disturbing, but it was disturbing. And I think what's most disturbing is to know that it's still going on today, to know that we have leadership in all forms and levels of government that are much more diverse. We have an acknowledgement that demographics are changing and the needs are changing when you have groups like the EDC, saying that we need to do more investments and we need to really think about this. And one thing that really kind of shocked me was, I'm a San Diegan, and I remember when San Diego decided to take out Martin Luther King Street and to call it the highway instead, and to know that the symbol of Martin Luther King is a highway that was created to, again, keep people out is disturbing, to say the least, and not in any way an honor. Maybe it would be almost like calling the border wall the Cesar Chavez border wall. It's really offensive, actually. The other thing too, and you mentioned creative solutions, and so I just wanted to bring up one thing with just prerogative, moderators' prerogative. One of the things that we're doing with LISC is we very much understand the information you've provided in terms of, you look at a community like City Heights and you look at a community like Kensington and Talmadge, and one of the things that you really see is that in order to live in Kensington and Talmadge, you've got to buy or rent 5,000 or 7,000 square feet of land. You don't have to do the same in City Heights, actually. And so you don't have to do the same actually in Mission Hills, in Point Loma, in La Jolla, and all those areas that the redlining information that you shared shows us. And in fact, the redlining maps themselves and the write-ups actually say that single family zoning R1 is a reason to invest in these neighborhoods. And so what we're asking our local government, and all local governments can do this, is to support an initiative where you take 5,000 or 7,000 square feet of land and you allow it to be subdivided into four different parcels. And when you subdivide it, you lower the price point of the individual parcels, and then you add construction costs. You've actually taken $1 million, 5,000 square foot $1 million land parcel, and you've created a $500,000 home potentially.
That's fantastic.
It is. And so, and again, going back to what you were saying, this isn't policy in Washington, D.C. This isn't policy in Sacramento. This is policy here in the city of San Diego, to the men and women who many of us help elect, the men and women who we rub shoulders with in a post-COVID world in the grocery store. So that's fascinating. I wanted to ask you a question a little bit about 1968. And I got a question here about, tell us a little bit more about this vote in the city of San Diego in 1968. What was it called? And what more can you share? Because that doesn't seem very long ago that we were talking about these things.
So it's Proposition 14 repealed the Rumford Fair Housing Act. The Rumford Fair Housing Act was designed to prevent housing discrimination, and Prop 14 was designed to repeal it. Very similar to Prop 8, if you remember that, which was where there was a law that said, okay, we're going to treat everybody equally, and then there was a proposition that said, no, don't. And in the same way, Prop 14 came in after the Rumford Fair Housing Act to say, no, we like our housing discrimination, please do not take it away. And so Rumford was in 1966, and then Prop 14 was Rumford was in 1962, 63. Prop 14 was in 1964, and then Prop 14 was declared unconstitutional in California in 1966, and then in the US in 1967.
Amazing. Wow, and it stands to reason that, you know, history is so important, but it's also important that it's remembered. And I think
Yes.
that's the message here, is that we really, when it comes to our communities and how they look, we don't know why they look that way. And I think you've shed a lot of light and scratched the surface. You know,
And there's a real irony of me doing these presentations, you know, like I'm like literally the worst person to do this, but I'm like straight white, you know, dude who's just like, I've had every privilege in the world, you know. You know, one of the reasons that I felt like it's really important to share this information is because it's so little known, and it took me a long time to kind of collect it. And back in 2019, I was working with Workforce Partnership to try to guide our efforts in addressing racial inequality. And as I started looking into this, I was just blown away. You know, you read that article from academic geography article from the 70s that talks about how people referred to San Diego as Little Georgia, and how the police harassed people just for hanging out outside of Southeast. Like if you found a Black person outside of Southeast, you would just harass them. That was what the police did. And so, you know, all this stuff is like, we need to get it out there. We need people to understand. And you know, you and I talked the other day about how if nobody's ever given you an explanation for how things are, you just assume it's the natural way of things, right? And if nobody, you know, we all grew up in a society where white people are rich, Black and Hispanic people are poor. Why is that? And if you don't have an explanation for it, you might think, well, you know, these people care less about their community, or work less hard, or don't value education, or whatever. And those are the most popular explanations when you ask white Americans. And the problem is that we don't teach this. You know, this should be step one of American history, is to understand, why are we the way we are? It's not by accident.
Yeah, it's something else you said that was really kind of interesting is, you know, I think prior to the unfortunate passing of George Floyd, I think the former Mayor Faulkner's statement would have seemed normal, right? It would have seemed normal to say we need to do equally for all. But the reality is that's not the case. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, and to be fair to Mayor Faulkner, that was before the murder of George Floyd.
It was, absolutely.
But you know, that's exactly right. You know, we have this idea that equality means giving everybody the same public resources. But equality is really giving everybody the same opportunity. And if public resources have been used over the last decades to deprive a certain group of people of opportunity, then we need more resources invested to undo that. It's like if yesterday I stole $100 from you, and then today we went to lunch and I said, let's split it. You'd say, F you, buddy. Like, you know, no, you stole $100 from me. I'm not going to split lunch with you. You pay, you know? So we just need to take responsibility, right? We need to say, look, you know, I'm a white man in America. These policies, they were implemented for me. My ancestors had a view of the way the world should be. And that view was, let's give more to our children at the expense of other people's children. And I don't want to participate in that worldview. I don't want to embrace their vision for me. You know, I love my parents and my grandparents, the ancestors that I know. I don't think that they're evil, but they had a flawed vision. And especially my great-grandparents and above had a very deeply flawed vision for America. And I don't want to participate in it. And the only way to not participate in it is not to say, okay, you know, we've stolen all this stuff, but let's just wipe the slate clean. The only way to do it is to put our hand on the scale and say, we are going to bring this back to balance. And that's not going to happen by simply stepping away and saying it'll all work itself out, because in a capitalist system, which I am a big fan of capitalism, I'm an economist, I believe in capitalism, but in a capitalist system without intervention, people who have resources, there's such a thing as returns to resources, returns to wealth. If you have wealth, you can get more wealth. It's not that hard. And if you're in poverty, it's very easy to slip into deeper and deeper poverty.
Yeah, I think you mentioned a minute ago, maybe you're not the right messenger, but looking at the comments here, actually you are the right messenger. I think there's a lot of folks that are responding to what you said with respect to being a white man in America, and that those privileges are not privileges you asked for, and they're privileges that you don't want, and they're privileges that you think we need to change. And so I would urge you, and I think others on just by reading the comments here, to share that more broadly, because I think it goes without saying that we've had leaders, and whether it's the civil rights movement, the Chicano movement, and other movements that have said these things. But I think there's a power, and again, I think we're still in that world where we're learning all this, but there's a power in seeing you say those things. And so I think, at least according to the comments that I'm looking at, they're calling it refreshing, they're calling it incredible. And so I think that's a plug for you to keep talking about things the way you are, and keep saying that you benefit, and that you recognize that, and that you want to change that, because I think that's really empowering. Question for you, just recently we've heard here in San Diego that universal basic income may be coming here. We have a nonprofit that's interested in that. We have a mayor in National City that's interested in that. We have our mayor of San Diego that's interested in that. Is that part of the solution? Is that an answer?
Okay, so I want to be very careful in this session to stick with facts, because I think sometimes, we can categorize each other along a political spectrum and say, well, this person is just advocating for liberal policy or conservative policy, or this person just has this perspective, and then dismiss them. And so far, what I've shared with you is only objective fact. And I think it's really important that we reframe the conversation around racism in America to say, you don't, as the famous saying goes, you can pick your opinions, but you can't pick the facts. The facts speak for themselves. And the reality is that we have severe racial inequality in America. And people who want to say, well, that's just your opinion, wrong. That is not just my opinion. I am coming at this as a quantitative economist. I look at the data, I look at the history, and it tells one story. It doesn't tell two possible stories. So I have opinions about universal basic income and what the likely outcomes are. And I think that there's some evidence that could give us a hint of that. But I want to really draw a very clear line of separation between any speculation that I might do on a subject like that, which is hotly debated politically, and a more concrete analysis of facts. And I want to just really make that very clear line of separation. The material that I've presented in this presentation is not up for debate. There aren't two perspectives on this. There's not someone who says, oh, the Red Summer of 1919 never happened. Oh, yeah, violent white mobs never dropped bombs on Black communities in Tulsa, right? Like, nobody is saying that that didn't happen. That would be like Holocaust denial. It's just insane. It's off the reservation. It's extremist. It's disconnected from reality. So I want to draw a very clear line there. I think universal basic income is a really creative idea. And I think that there's some positive evidence to support it. And I think that one of the things that we should ask ourselves is not just, what do I think would happen with universal basic income? Because that's one thing that people will say is, oh, well, if you give people money, they'll stop working. Well, that's an empirical question, right? Will they stop working? The evidence out of Bakersfield says, actually, they'll work more because they'll have the resources to get the training that they need and to be able to find jobs and all that. So no, that's not true. That doesn't mean that UBI is like the way to go and absolutely this is the solution to our problems. But I would just caution people again, let's not assume we know what's going to happen. Let's ask, let's look at the data, let's find out. And the data in universal basic income is people keep working. and often they have the resources to be able to work in fields where they're going to be able to get ahead better.
And I think the important part that you mentioned there too is it doesn't negate all of the hard work we need to do to understand the structural racism and to change it, right? I mean, you still have, again, like things like single family zoning that are still in place, and we really do need to dig deep at that history. That's really important. A good question here I have is, you know, with the Fair Housing Act, Equal Credit Opportunity Act, how do we target communities that we know were left out of wealth building and home ownership? And I think about this recently. We wrote an op-ed in Voice of San Diego, and I got an email from a gentleman, and it was about home ownership for BIPOC families, grant down payment program that we're working on. And he said, you really meant undeserved or poor white folks as well, didn't you? And I struggled with that, and I kind of let it off like, well, we care about everybody. But the reality is, that's not the case. And maybe we shouldn't be thinking about it, kind of like your conversation in equity. So we've got these laws. How do we rethink them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I sometimes approach this in my personal life from a position of my faith, which is, you know, like I look at the Beatitudes. You know, Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor," you know, and like white Americans would say, all lives are blessed, you know, like, no, yeah, sure, everybody matters, but also let's focus.
Or history matters.
Yeah, history matters. Let's focus on the people who, exactly as you say, have been disadvantaged. There's no question that poverty is a scourge in America, and that it is really a disadvantage to be poor. And there's no question that white people who are poor really struggle, just like anybody who's poor. The irony is that if you're rich, race doesn't matter nearly as much as if you're poor. So when we say, oh, well, okay, racism, but I grew up poor. Well, guess what? If you grew up poor and white, you actually, in some ways, experienced more white privilege or racial privilege than if you grew up rich and white. Because if two people walk into a room wearing a business suit with a fancy tie, it doesn't matter as much if they're white or black. But if they walk into the room wearing a hoodie, now it really matters. Now it really, really matters. And the fact is that there's always going to be a distribution of wealth. There's always going to be rich folks and poor folks, you know, no matter what we do. You know, like, this is not a communist society. We're always going to have a natural some distribution. Now, I think we can do more to raise the floor rather, so that, you know, we can eliminate some of the negative consequences of poverty. But there's always going to be some variance from an economic perspective. There's going to be some variance in the data. There's going to be people who make more money and people who make less money. And so the goal is to get the averages to match up. And so, yeah, you know, we need to be doing as much as we can to serve poor people, white, Black, Hispanic, Native American, Asian, doesn't matter. We need to be serving all poor people. But that's a separate project than the project of undoing centuries of racial discrimination. It's a separate project. It's kind of like saying, well, what about women? Well, yeah, let's help women too, right? And women face different challenges. So there's actually not a big difference in wealth between men and women, because most women are part of families that also have men who have the privilege of having been able to accumulate wealth, right? So there's not a big wealth difference, but there's a big income difference, right? So we need to be targeted in that work. So in every project, we need to be targeted at addressing the root causes and the most, the dire need. So we do poverty work and we do anti-racism work.
Wow.
And they don't have to be competing with each other. right? They're two separate, crucial projects.
That's fascinating because you're absolutely right. And I think in kind of going to your answer to UBI, there is an issue of poverty, but there's also this systematic racism that again, has segregated our communities, that again, you could easily say, who goes to that school, or what are the test scores in that school, just based upon the kids that go there, the color of the kids that go to the school. And so you're absolutely right that there are two conversations, and the idea that we would now kind of lump them together and say, well, let's do it for all. Actually, that negates the responsibility that we have as Americans, right? As people in this country, to really do the right thing. One thing that really stood out was your interest in fair scheduling. I have family members that this is a challenge for them. At the drop of the hat, they pick up the phone and it's, you got to come in now, or you got to come in the next hour. And oftentimes for professionals or salaried individuals, that's not something we worry about. We don't worry about the fact that our boss is going to call us, 10 o'clock the night before and say, I want you here at 5 in the morning. And I don't care how you do it if you want your job. But we also know it's very controversial, or it seems to be very controversial. And again, it really shows who's benefiting, who isn't, right? Because again, the people that say it's controversial usually have the luxury and opportunity to have a set schedule or to change their own schedule. Tell us more about the interest in workforce partnership. And I think there'll be folks like Lisk and others that would be interested in being a part of that conversation.
I should be
Seems
very
so commonplace.
I should be very careful about how I talk about this, because I've gotten in some hot water.
But I'll say this though: the thing about it is, just like having sick time or sick days, it's very common sense, and yet we have people pushing back on that. But again, I reinforce the fact that people that are pushing back usually already have the benefit, so they're not concerned. And we really should be more thoughtful about this, especially again, if we're dealing with human beings, their families, and we want them to be successful and their kids to be successful.
I'll say the workforce partnerships interest in this is in working directly with employers to develop creative ways to provide job quality to their employees. The workforce partnerships interest in this is not to dictate policy or to convince city council members to do this or that, or county supervisors or something like that. We're not a policy-oriented organization, but we work with employers around the county, and we've actually had some real success in, kind of working with employers to develop practices that really benefit their employees. The National Association of Restaurants has estimated that the annual turnover in the restaurant industry is 75%. That's wildly high, and it's very expensive to keep replacing people. And I think that there's room for innovation here. And I'm not a restaurateur, so I'm sure that there will be people who say, look, you don't know, you've never run a restaurant. But I look at the evidence, and I look at, for example, especially I think in retail, I think the case is really clear in retail, where, for example, Gap experimented with providing stable schedules, and they intended to do a long-term pilot, and the pilot was so successful that they canceled it and just rolled it out for all the stores to provide more stable scheduling. And then they did a second experiment where they guaranteed a certain number of hours to some employees and increased their staffing. And what they did is they generated about $30 million of extra revenue on about $30,000 of investment. Sorry, $3 million, not 30 million, 3 million on 30,000 of investment, which is a 10,000% return on investment, right? Like, that's wild. So I think that there really are opportunities to innovate in this area. So the workforce partnerships interest in this is in working with individual employers who are interested in developing their own practices. And there are people who do really amazing work around this. And you look at some restaurants like Ponce's that have people, who work there for 10 years.
Yeah.
Right. That's your local restaurant.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
and they're closed Sundays.
Wonderful place. Yeah. And they they hire everybody in at the lowest level, right? They hire everybody in at, dish cleaner or, whatever it is, chip runner, and then they work their way up, and they know what the development looks like, and they know what to expect, and they're given opportunities to grow. I think another thing is I want to mention, restaurant work can be great work in San Diego County. And I think one of the things that we've made a mistake of at Workforce Partnership is underestimating wages in the restaurant industry, because it's so hard to measure tipped wages. But one thing, one organization, a restaurant that I really admire up in the Bay Area called Aki, which is like a California CalMex, like a local chain. They provide on their website, they show, we took 2 months of data and we calculated that the average person in this role earns this much in their wage and this much per hour in tips. And everything they say, okay, so you're going to make, $15 an hour doing this, and then you're going to get an extra $4 an hour of tips. And so you're making $19 an hour, or you're making $24 and you're an extra $5 of tips and you're making $29 an hour. And it allows people to make those decisions with full information. I really encourage people to think about those kind of creative practices that they can take. It doesn't necessarily require policy intervention. Where people are reticent to provide these basic benefits, I think sometimes there is a place for policy, but that's my personal opinion. The Workforce Partnership is really interested in working individually with people to develop creative new practices.
No, makes a lot of sense. One question I had for you that really kind of shocked me, actually. When you were talking about the redlining maps. I've seen those maps for over and over again, and I never paid much attention. I never saw the thing that said prepared by the City of San Diego Department of Engineers. I never saw that little piece there, right? Do you know about the history of the City of San Diego with respect to their disinvestment or lack of investment purposefully in communities of color? Because we hear about it from the banks, the federal government, right. Yes, had a hand in it too. But what about our local government?
Yeah. So I'll admit I'm not an expert on the subject, but I've read the documents that were used to create that map. And those documents were prepared by the city and by the federal government. And it's disturbing when you read through it, and you realize how obsessed with race people were at that time. And, it's funny because often you hear white folks in America saying, why does everything have to be about race? Why do you have to make race such a big deal? Why does race have to be such a big deal? Well, it's not people of color who made race a big deal, right? The one drop of Black blood makes you property instead of a person was the invention of white folks. When we talk about, oh, why does race have to be a big deal? Sorry, our ancestors decided that for us. They decided to make race a huge deal, a deal that determined whether you were a person at all or not. So now we're just dealing with the consequences of that. We're not trying to invent a new category of race and make it a big deal. It's already a big deal because our ancestors made it a big deal. And when I say our, I mean me and the other white folks. The political leadership in our country decided to make this a big deal. Now we are responding to the problem that they created, and it's our responsibility to fix it. But that idea of, oh, why does it have to be such a big deal is just so frustrating because you look at, in those redlining documents, they even talk about, well, this has an encroachment of Italians. And it's like, what the F? Like, they're obsessed with keeping everything lily white. And, I think, again, it's like if I stole $100 from you yesterday and you were like, hey, maybe you should pay for lunch. And I was like, why are you obsessed with money? It's like, hey, buddy, you stole from me. Like this, So, I know that none of us today created this. Now, 2/3 of the people who are alive and voting in San Diego in 1964 did.
Yeah.
But
That's kind of shocking.
You know, us Gen Xers and millennials, we didn't intend to, Gen Z, we didn't intend to create this situation, but we live with it, right? And we have to do something about it. And again, it was created, for the white folks in the audience, for our benefit, right? My ancestors wanted their progeny to succeed. And in order to do that, they did it on the backs of other people. And so I have to decide whether to just hoard everything that I can or do something about it. And I think there's a big place for individual action. We talked about policy, we talked about, businesses and organizations taking action. I also think that there's a big role for individuals to take, when we decided to buy our house, we decided to buy a house that had an extra unit. And this was my wife, who's a better person than I, said, look, we have the resources, we could get a house with an extra unit and we can rent it below market value to people who have been traditionally excluded. All of us have the opportunities to take individual actions to try to address this, to make donations to local organizations, to get connected with LISC,
That's right.
get connected to people who are trying to make a difference in the area and see what you can do as an individual. Also, see what you can do as a member of the institutions you belong to. And that means addressing hiring practices and things like that. And if you want help with that, please reach out to me, Daniel@workforce.org. But there's so much that each one of us can do. And the goal has to be to get back to the natural state of equality, where not that everybody has the exact same resources, but that the average amount of resources that a white person has, and a Black person has, and a Hispanic person has, and an Asian person has, and a Native American person has, everybody has, multiracial people. If you don't think that should be equal on average, why? Why don't you think that should be equal? What is it that you think makes some people, based on the color of their skin, less deserving? We have to ask ourselves that. And until we get to that place, there's more work to be done.
Yeah, again, I can't stress enough when you really look at your own family and your own history and you say it has to change, the comments just light up. And so you've hit a nerve. I think you've hit a nerve by saying something that maybe we don't see very often, which is a white man saying things have got to change and that the white privilege that I have needs to be dismantled purposefully, and this is how we have to go about it. And I think there's something there that's very powerful. And again, I go back to when you said I shouldn't be saying this message. Well, I think that message is something very important to be said, and thankfully you're saying it.
I mean, the irony, of course, is that part of my privilege is that when I present this argument, people applaud me for it. And when a person of color presents this information, people are skeptical and they say, well, is that just your own personal interest?
Right.
Is that that's your own selfish take on things, or you're just trying to get special treatment, right? Special treatment, the boogeyman. So yeah, it's kind of like if you've ever read The Scarlet Letter, the pastor gets up there and says, we should all be better. And, I'm not so great. And, he actually wasn't so great, but everybody applauded him for doing that because, oh, wow, impressive,
Yeah,
so
that's true.
I think, if you are hearing this from me, I just encourage you to hear it from people who actually have personal experience. I have a dear friend who grew up in the 40s, Black, in the South. So he's seen some stuff. And he said, the hardest thing for me is being told every day that my experience is a fiction. Being told by people, that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
You haven't actually experienced, discrimination. That's in your head.
Mm-hmm.
And, this is such a silly story, but I'll share it. The other day, maybe a year ago or something, my wife and I went to the zoo. And as we were leaving the zoo, they have the turnstiles that you walk through, and then they also can open up a little gate to let you through if you've got a stroller or something like that. And there was a couple ahead of us, and they opened up the gate and they let them through. And then when we started going through that gate, they said, oh, actually, could you go through the turnstile? And the couple ahead of us was black and we were white. And it struck me, if this had been the opposite situation, and we had been the black couple, and they had said, no, 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 we let these people through, but not you. I would have had to ask myself, is this a race thing? Is this like, are they just being crappy to me because I'm black? Like, and my privilege is that I never have to worry about that. Mm-hmm. So even the things that aren't motivated by discrimination, you have to wonder about. And imagine living that way. If you're somebody who's never had to ask yourself, is the way I'm treated because of my race? Think about what a privilege that is. Think of how much stress has been taken out of your life. It's disturbing, right? And so I think I just want to encourage people, if they've been able to listen to this presentation and treat it seriously and accept the facts that have been shared, I encourage them to also listen to people who have personal experience with this, and not to discount them or to say, well, you're just, advocating for yourself or looking for special treatment, right? At the day that we reach equality, where the average Black American, the average Hispanic American, is making the same on average as the average white American, then when someone says, hey, could we do this or do that? Fine, then you can say you're looking for special treatment. But until we get there, people are just looking to be made whole from what's been taken from them.
Yeah, that's powerful. 10 years ago or so, I went to Barcelona. I was an English teacher, and I landed in Barcelona, and I would walk around and I said, no one's really looking at me, so maybe they don't see my race. Maybe they really don't see that. And about 3 months into it, I went to a job interview to be an English teacher, and the woman was an American, and she said to me, I have a final question for you. I said, what? And she said, are people very discriminatory towards you? And I said, no, in fact, I'd been thinking the opposite. And she said, because the people in Barcelona are very prejudiced against Moroccans, and you look Moroccan. It changed my outlook. It really did. And you started to see it everywhere. Or I think about the director Jordan Peele and the fact that he does horror movies, because there is something horror-like about it. I walk around in the neighborhood of Kensington where I live, and I oftentimes, if I'm walking my dog and looking in people's homes because I'm a looky-loo and I want to see homes, I do get nervous that somebody's going to pull up and say, hey, can I help you? And how will I react? I know I'm going to react pleasant, but I'm inside my frustration. And there is a sense of horror to this, that you're right, that some Americans do not have to go through. And it's shocking. I want to take a second here to ask a question from the Vice Mayor of National City, Jose Rodriguez. He says, are there ideas around increasing home ownership opportunities within the city of National City? And I guess that would be collectively for all.
That's a great question. I could do some research on it. I'm not aware of anything specific to National City. I know, there's something I heard recently, which I loved, that I think Mission Driven Finance is working on a project around childcare. So, childcare industries have been just tanked by the pandemic, and it's been really, really difficult for them. And even before the pandemic, we had such a shortage of affordable, reliable childcare. And Mission Driven Finance has this idea of, if they can work with people who want to set up childcare services and help them buy homes out of which they can provide childcare, then essentially they're helping home ownership, they're helping start a business, and there's a return on that, right? Which is that person's then going to make money on that business, right? So it's kind of like an impact capital approach to it. So I would encourage you to reach out to Mission Driven Finance. I think that they're doing super creative, innovative work on this. But in terms of home ownership, I'm not quite as aware. I'm really aware of efforts to do workforce development, because that's the world I live in.
Right.
And there's amazing, amazing work being done around workforce development and helping people get better jobs. And Workforce Partnership is creating a kind of evergreen fund that funds what's called income share agreements, where people can get upskilled and they don't pay a thing, but then over the next 5 years, for 3 years worth of months, they owe some very small portion, 2-3%, whatever, of their income. They pay back into the fund to fund the next person who gets this kind of training, right? And we do it in partnership with UC San Diego Extension. And we've been training people to become Java programmers and front-end developers and digital marketers. And basically they get this class that would normally be $4,000, $6,000, something like that. And they get it for free. And then they pay back into this fund that's a way of paying it forward. And it creates a real sense of community around raising everybody's engagement. And I know that one of the things that we're exploring is the possibility of partnering with cities as money comes in from the federal government post-pandemic to create evergreen funds within that city where we can serve residents of that city in perpetuity. So if they're able to set aside, it has to be a fairly large expenditure, a few $1 million, but you can create a evergreen fund that will allow people who are employed to get upskilled. Now, people who are unemployed, we're already helping provide services for those individuals for free, funded by the federal government. But the federal government doesn't want to spend money on people who are already employed and underemployed, right? And we have all these people who are in jobs where they're really going to struggle to find a pathway to the middle class. But in order to upskill people, if we can work with cities to take some of the money, the stimulus money that's coming in from the federal government, and set aside in a fund, then we can have an evergreen solution where we can provide residents with opportunities to get upskilled and get into tech and healthcare and all of these really high-paying jobs. So I really encourage you, if you're interested in the workforce development area, to reach out to me or to any of my colleagues at Workforce Partnership. But in terms of housing, I'd say mission-driven finance is a great place to start.
Yeah, and I'll just mention real quick to the Vice Mayor, again, look at your zoning. Because if you rethink your zoning, you actually will lower the price point, which will make it more accessible to families. And then you pair that with a grant down payment program like we're starting with many folks here in San Diego that you'll hear about this month. It makes it more accessible to families. So that's something that the city can actually do, is rethink the zoning to subdivide properties so that, again, people can buy a home. The value's not as high as it currently is. Well, Daniel, Professor, this has been incredible. Again, I think back to when you started the conversation, you said, I may not be the right messenger, but I think you were the right messenger and you are the right messenger. And I think, again, hearing your comments about your past and the way you look at it now, I think it's refreshing. And I can't tell you enough that people really responded to that. So thank you so much for opening this conference for us. And we wish you the best. And of course, we know you're just around the corner at the Workforce Partnership. So we're also very, very pleased that you're in the community. You're working on behalf of the residents as well. So thank you. And I'll
thank you so much for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you. And I'll turn that over to Stephen Russell, the CEO of the Housing Federation. Stephen.
Great. Thank you, Ricardo, for leading that conversation. Daniel, thank you so much for being here. It means a lot to us that we can create a space for this kind of discussion here, and that clearly it's struck more than just a nerve. It's hits us in the heart. And but I think taking it to a hopeful place of things we can do. This is what we're here for today, but this is a really important foundation for the rest of the conference. I do want to encourage folks that to take a break. We're going to take a break here in just a moment. You do have separate links for the morning and the afternoon, so please use your afternoon link when you come back at 11. Really, thank you again, Daniel. We are working on some workforce programs within the Federation itself and our membership and the residents, and so I will definitely be reaching out to you to discuss that in some detail. But really, thank you for leading this discussion. It was very hard. Your warnings at the beginning, I wasn't sure what you could possibly be showing us that would be so disturbing, and you took us and led us safely through a very dark valley, but we're coming into the light now. So everybody, go outside, go get some sunlight. let's come back and let's talk about the things we're going to do here. So thank you all, and enjoy your break.